My topic tonight is reading the Bible after the Shoah, and I was asked to speak specifically on historical works or historical traditions in the Bible. Because one of the things that happens with the Shoah is that the Shoah or Holocaust, as many of you may know the name better, actually challenges our traditional notions of right and wrong or sin and punishment that we have in the Bible. We oftentimes assume that the model is one that if one sins, then one is punished for one's sins. If one is righteous, then one enjoys beneficence from the divine. But one of the realities of the Shoah is that when you're dealing with as many as 12 or 13 million dead, 6 million Jews who were deliberately targeted, another 6 million gypsies, Slavs, gays and lesbians, and other figures who were not considered to be fully human in the eyes of Nazi Germany, you have a major genocide that takes place in modern times. And just to be sure, the issue does not end with the Shoah of World War II. If you're listening to the news today, you know that the Kurds in the Middle East are under assault right now. And Yazidi populations, many of us probably didn't even know who they were, are being exterminated, sold into slavery, and their culture is being completely destroyed. This is a recurrent issue in the world. And I note you have here a program in human rights. That's something to think about for the future. What is our responsibility as religious people to see to it that these sorts of things do not happen and to act at times when there is a threat to our world, our sense of world order. In looking at historical traditions in the Bible, one of the things to bear in mind is that, like the debate on the Shoah, there is debate in the Bible as well. When Shoah scholarship first emerged in the aftermath of World War II, there were any number of interpreters, Jewish theologians, and later Christian theologians as well, who would ask, what is the meaning of the Shoah for Jewish thought, later Christian thought, and ultimately we hope to see Islamic and Buddhist thought as well. And what happened is that there were a number of proposals. Richard Rubinstein, for example, argued that if you take the traditional notions of sin and punishment, or righteousness and restoration, or salvation, as Christians would call it, you couldn't fit the Shoah into that model. Because Rubinstein asked, what could 6 million Jews have done to deserve, through sin, punishment that would see not simply the murder, deliberate murder and genocide against 6 million Jews, but including 1.5 million children, all the way from infancy through your own ages now, who perished in that Shoah. And so it challenged our traditional notions of sin and punishment that we learn from the Bible. Other interpreters had other suggestions. Emil Fackenheim argued that it was a clarion call for Jews to refuse to give Hitler a posthumous victory. And for Fackenheim, the 614th commandment of Judaism was that you adhere to Judaism, that the Shoah then was that call. Other interpreters said it meant that humans had to take responsibility. Eliezer Berkovitz argued that this was the sign that we human beings had to serve as partners with God in the world to ensure a moral world order. Abraham Joshua Heschel argued that God essentially cried or suffered as a result of what went wrong in the world, because when we human beings were given our chance to exercise our sense of moral responsibility in the world, it didn't work. And so you have a variety of viewpoints that interpret the Shoah, and others are still emerging as thinkers wrestle with the moral problems of the Shoah. But one of the facts of the matter is that wrestling with the idea of sin and punishment and righteousness and reward is a debate that's taking place in the Bible as well. And one of the places it takes place is within the historical traditions of the Bible. Now, I understand Professor Willis, in his introductory Hebrew Bible course, is starting to deal with the book of Joshua. And when we think of histories in the Bible, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings that constitute what is called the former prophets in Judaism is generally understood to be pretty much the primary historical tradition in the Bible. What I intend to do this evening is look at Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, but also compare it to other historical traditions in the Bible. The Chronicles, which oftentimes repeats what you see in Joshua through Kings, but does so through a different lens. And then there's another historical book, the book of Esther, that will have theological ramifications as well, particularly since God is never explicitly mentioned in the book. So we'll look at these and understand that our historical traditions do not agree with each other in their understanding of ancient Israel's history. And one of the reasons they don't agree is because they've got the same problem to explain that modern theologians have to explain in relation to the Shoah. Why does disaster happen? And when you think about disaster as presented in the Bible, you have to think about the various exiles that took place in both Israel and Judah throughout biblical history. Many of you probably already know that Israel constituted two kingdoms. To the north, you had the more powerful northern kingdom of Israel based on a 10-tribe structure. That kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in what is now northern Iraq, the same place where the Islamic State is being founded. Mosul, that you may hear about in the news, is the site of ancient Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. 722, 721 BCE, the Assyrian Empire invaded northern Israel, destroyed its capital city, and took many of its surviving population off into captivity in other parts of the world. And one of the problems was to explain, why did that happen? The other exile, of course, happened in the southern kingdom of Judah, 150 years later, 588, 587, 586 BCE. Judah was invaded by the Babylonian Empire, which is the southern portion of what is now Iraq. The kingdom was destroyed. Jerusalem, Solomon's temple were destroyed. And again, people from Judah were taken into captivity or exile into what is now Mesopotamia or modern Iraq, where they founded a Jewish community that's lasted until nearly modern times. Now, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are written to present the history of Israel from the time of Joshua, when Israel first emerges in the land, until the aftermath of the Babylonian exile. And so, historiographically speaking, you have to ask, why do we read history? We read history to learn from it, to learn from mistakes that are made, to learn from the strengths that emerge, and to apply those lessons to the future when we try to build our own states or act in the world. What lessons do we learn from the past, either positive or negative? And so our former prophets will take a position that's based upon the Torah, book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, which will argue that Israel should observe one God. If you're familiar with Judaism's Shema, the watchword of Judaism, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That is a quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and becomes one of the foundations for the historical traditions that we see in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, oftentimes called the Deuteronomistic history because of its dependence on Deuteronomic concepts. It calls for worship of one God, having one sanctuary, never tells you where, but one sanctuary, to avoid foreign gods, to observe divine Torah, or the commandments of God, and to make sure that the king has a copy of the Torah that he reads daily, so that he will understand properly how to serve as a righteous ruler. And the way in which Joshua through Judges is set up, you'll note if you read Joshua, it's a campaign of conquest. And basically, all of the land of Canaan is handed to Israel as if it was on a silver platter. How many of you know how many Israelites died in the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua? 36. That's it. And why do they die? Because in one campaign against the city of Ai, a man named Achan had embezzled part of the treasury of God. There was sin in the community, and consequently, the punishment was the first assault on Ai failed. 36 Israelites died, and when that sin was then removed, then God gave the land to Israel. Otherwise, when you look at the campaigns, no one dies. Now, we know that's not historically the case, because when you look even in the Bible itself, the first chapter of Judges speaks about the fact that not all the Canaanites died. They were still there. And so what happens is that after you see God showing fidelity to the covenant in the book of Joshua, then Judges, Samuel, and Kings are designed to show that Israel did not observe God's will, and that through the course of history, ultimately there was a decline that led to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah, i.e., this Deuteronomistic history, or Joshua through Judges, is founded on the principle that if you do wrong, you will be punished. If you do right, you will be rewarded. Reverse that. If you were punished, you must have done wrong. Okay, now, let's look at that premise. Because in these books, the notion that Israel sinned is based on the notion that past ancestors had sinned, that would then have an effect on later generations. When you look at the northern kingdom of Israel and read the history of Israel in the book of Kings, Kings will argue that the founding monarch of the northern kingdom of Israel committed a sin so great that ultimately he was responsible for the destruction of the kingdom 200 years later. This is King Jeroboam ben Nevat, the first king of northern Israel, who ascended the throne after northern Israel revolted from the house of David. And when you read the account of Jeroboam in Kings, he's presented as the worst possible monarch you could ever find. Complete violation of Deuteronomic principles. How many of you are familiar with the notion of the golden calves in ancient Israel? According to 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam was a consummate sinner. When he became king, one of his first moves was to build or establish sanctuaries in Beit El and Dan. And we are told that he erected golden calves in those sanctuaries as idols for the people to worship. Told them, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Worship them. We are told that he allowed anybody to become a priest. You didn't have to go to Pepperdine to study religion. Basically anybody could be a priest when you read 1 Kings 12. We're told that he fooled around with the calendar, didn't observe the holidays at the proper time. And so, because of all the various sins religious sins that Jeroboam committed, violating the laws of Deuteronomy, God ultimately decided to destroy northern Israel. And the way that happens, when you read the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, you go through 200 years of kings of northern Israel, and every one has an evaluation at the beginning of his account. And one of the first things you read is that King such and such, son of such and such, was however many years old when he ascended the throne, and he ruled for whatever years, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord because he followed in the sins of Jeroboam. All of the northern Israelite kings are condemned for following Jeroboam, and once the book of Kings gives you the account of the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel, 2 Kings 17, they tell you that this happened because all the kings followed the sins of Jeroboam in worshiping the golden calves and everything else. Jeroboam led Israel astray, and consequently, national disaster took place. Now, that's a very interesting proposition. It would be like claiming that the United States was punished because George Washington did something wrong. Maybe he didn't throw a silver dollar across the Potomac. Of course, he couldn't have because they didn't have silver dollars in those days. Maybe he did cut down the cherry tree. But look at the moral problem. Somebody in the past commits sin, and an entire nation suffers. Suppose we suffered nuclear attack today, right this moment. All of us sitting here. Every one of us would suffer for that. And if it was blamed on George Washington, you might ask yourself, did I participate in George Washington's sins? Probably not. I don't think you were around then. None of us were around then 200 years ago. And yet that's what Kings wants us to understand. Now, that's a morally problematic assertion, but Kings will continue along those lines because not only does it have to explain the fall of northern Israel, but it also has to explain the fall of southern Judah. And after the fall of the northern kingdom, Judah is destroyed 150 years later. Why? When you read the book of Kings, the reason for Jerusalem's destruction was because of the reign of King Manasseh of Judah. King Manasseh, you'll find the accounts of his reign in 2 Kings chapter 21. It describes him as the worst monarch of the house of David because he made the streets of Jerusalem run red with the blood of his enemies. And it's remarkable because he's also the longest reigning monarch. He reigns for 55 years. Even David and Solomon only got 40 years apiece. But what's so remarkable about 2 Kings 21 account of his reign is that they have a paragraph that explains Manasseh was so sinful during his rule that God decided to destroy the city of Jerusalem and wipe it clean like one wipes a plate when you wash it and dry it. Brush off all the inhabitants, destroy the entire city because this man sinned. And that destruction would not take place during his lifetime. It would take place some 60 years after he died, i.e., later generations would suffer for the sins of this monarch. Now, what makes it even more remarkable is that Manasseh's great-grandson, King Josiah of Judah, is presented in the history as the greatest of the Davidic monarchs. We are told he is righteous, that he does not turn to the right or to the left. In observing Torah, he's completely observant, fully righteous, and fully with the support of God. But the book of Kings now has a problem. Because if it tells us that Jerusalem must be destroyed because of Manasseh, what do you do with a righteous monarch like Josiah? And so you see him undertaking temple reform. You see him fully observant. You see him destroying the altar at Beit El, where the golden calves have been worshipped. Everything he does is correct and in keeping with Deuteronomy. But King Josiah dies in 609 BCE at the age of 39. He's killed by the Egyptians. Why should he be punished? Kings explains the issue by stating 3 times that because God had decided to destroy Jerusalem during the reign of Josiah's great-grandfather, Manasseh, Josiah would be spared seeing the destruction of his nation by being granted an early death. This was a way of saving him from the pain and suffering of seeing his nation go down. So they claim he died early. 22 years after his death, Jerusalem was destroyed, and that becomes King's explanation for disaster. And note the principle in the former prophets, Joshua through Kings. You have sin being judgment being brought about for the sins of the ancestors on later generations. Now, many might find that to be a problematic theological stance. And the fact of the matter is, there are many in the Bible who would find that to be problematic. Many of you have read Job. What did Job ever do to suffer punishment? And many of us go through and try to find, okay, Job must have done this. But the fact of the matter is, Job is presented as a righteous man, and he suffers anyway. We have an alternative historical tradition in the Hebrew Bible, the books of Chronicles, which most people ignore. Why? Because it covers much of the same territory as Joshua through Kings. In fact, even traditional Jewish commentators, there was one who remarked hundreds of years ago, I never bothered to read the book of Chronicles. I always read the former prophets, Joshua through Kings. Why should I read Chronicles? But when you read Chronicles, you find that it takes a very different theological stance concerning the questions of sin and punishment. On the one hand, it will frequently correct grammatical readings that you'll find in Kings. Much of the material is drawn directly from Samuel and Kings. But it also has a way of debating the theological propositions that you see in the former prophets. Chronicles starts with creation, so it's already different there. It doesn't start with Joshua, it starts with creation. And in looking at the history of Israel, it will take you into the period of the kings, but there will be differences in the way in which it evaluates the 3 kings that I've laid out here, Jeroboam, Manasseh, and Josiah. When Chronicles looks at Jeroboam, they don't have a problem with him. Yes, he was the first king of northern Israel, unremarkable reign. They pass over him very quickly. They're not concerned with him. And they're generally not concerned with the northern kingdom of Israel. They're aware of it, but their focus is on Judah. Now, let's think out loud about what that might mean. When you look at Chronicles' presentation of the history, they've got the same problem. How do you explain the destruction of Jerusalem? And so, in looking at the reign of King Manasseh, 2 Chronicles 33 will give an account of Manasseh's reign that starts very much like the account you see in 2 Kings 21. Manasseh was wicked. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He made the streets of Jerusalem run red with the blood of his enemies. All the terrible things that he did, they're all laid out, almost word to word, drawn from Kings. But where Kings then introduces the paragraph that says God decides to destroy Jerusalem because of Manasseh's sins, Chronicles gives you a very different account. And what they tell you is that during King Manasseh's reign, the Assyrian monarch came to Jerusalem and put Manasseh in chains, hooks and chains, and dragged him off to Babylon, where he saw what was happening in the city of Babylon, and as a result of that experience, when he returned to Jerusalem, he became what Judaism calls a Baal Teshuvah. That is, a repentant person who returned to God and was righteous for the rest of his life. And so when you see Chronicles, there's a model of repentance. There's no condemnation of Manasseh after that point. He becomes an ideal monarch, builds many cities that you see down in the southern part of Judah, Beersheba and south from there, that are still subject to archaeological excavation, trying to figure out, okay, why were these cities built? And they were apparently built during the reign of Manasseh and helped to build up Judah's power. He was a great monarch. But we have to ask, number one, why would they report this particular event? And many scholars have always assumed Chronicles a priestly history. Well, in many circles, the priesthood is considered wrong. Protestant Christianity, you want prophets over priests. And so in Protestant scholarship in particular, priesthood raises questions. But one of the things about the priestly viewpoint is that they do not assign blame for wrongdoing on past generations. They assign blame on a present generation. If your generation suffers judgment, then that generation must have done something wrong. And that informs part of the perspective on Manasseh. But the other part is that Chronicles actually has much more of a reliable historical account of Manasseh's reign. During Manasseh's long reign of 55 years, the Assyrian Empire suffered internal revolt. In 652 BCE, Assyria in northern Iraq ruled Babylonia. And the Assyrian monarch Ashurbanipal had placed Babylon under the rule of his brother, Shamash-shum-ukin. I know you all remember that name. Now, how many of you have a brother? Okay, a lot of you do. You ever fight? Ever get into conflicts? I know you love your brothers, yes, but conflicts will emerge. Now, think about how those conflicts could play out on an international stage. Shamash-shum-ukin was jealous of his brother Ashurbanipal, and he thought, I should be the ruler of the Assyrian Empire, not Ashurbanipal. And so in Babylon, okay, great. I've got a great base of operations here. I can build up and take over. And so Shamash-shum-ukin, the brother of the Assyrian monarch, Ashurbanipal, revolted against his brother in a bid to make Babylon and himself independent of his brother's control. The result was a 5-year, very bloody, very costly war. And throughout that war, thousands of people lost their lives. It was a major disaster in the ancient Near Eastern world that ultimately weakened the Assyrian Empire and later led to its downfall. But the Assyrians won. They put down the Babylonian revolt, and they killed Shamash-shum-ukin. Ashurbanipal then continued as king of Assyria for the rest of his life. Now, how does that have an impact on Manasseh? Judah had been an ally of Babylonia. Manasseh's father, Hezekiah, had once revolted against the Assyrians, and his partner in revolt had been the kingdom of Babylonia a generation or two before. And the Assyrians looked at this and said, wait a minute, if Manasseh's father had been an ally of Babylon in the past, then what might happen now if Shamash Shumukin wins, or looks like he's going to win? Are the Judeans going to revolt? And that's what explains the narrative in Chronicles. The Assyrian king arrests Manasseh, hauls him off to Babylon, and what is he going to get to watch? He's going to see Babylon destroyed. He's going to see revolutionaries executed. And the message is going to be, you join this revolt, that's your fate, bud. And the message came through. Manasseh did not revolt. He returned to Jerusalem. Judah did not join the revolt. And in the end, Manasseh was credited by the chronicler as a great king who kept the peace of his country, built cities, built walls for them, and kept his country out of trouble. He was a great monarch in the end because he returned to God and kept his country safe. Now, kings also had argued that Josiah, Manasseh's great-grandson, had been a righteous monarch. But what about the chronicler? What does the chronicler think of Josiah? When you read the chronicler's account of Josiah, again, it talks about Josiah's greatness, how he renovated the temple, purified the temple, and placed his country on firm religious foundations. But they had a problem. The chronicler looked at the king's account and said, wait a minute, why should a righteous monarch die for the sins of his great-grandfather, especially since we've written the account to show that Manasseh repented from his sins? How do we then treat Josiah? And in Chronicles, Josiah is not the great hero that he was in Kings. When you see Josiah, he dies at the hands of the Egyptians. He tries to stop the Egyptians from sending their army north to help their allies, and meets them at Megiddo, a city in northern Israel. Whereas Kings said simply that the Pharaoh put Josiah to death when he met him there, and doesn't tell you why or how or anything about it, Chronicles describes a great battle that takes place. But before that battle happens, there is in Chronicles a conversation between the Pharaoh and Josiah, in which the Pharaoh tells him, what are you doing, Josiah? Your God commanded you not to interfere in this. What are you doing here? You're actually going against the word of your God. In the chronicler's narrative, Josiah persists. A battle ensues, and as a result, Josiah is killed in battle. And from the chronicler's standpoint then, Josiah dies, is punished, because he had actually done something wrong. Whereas Manasseh became a Baal Teshuvah, returns to God. In the chronicler's account, Josiah dies because at the last moment he turns away from God, as the narrator would present it. And so what you find in the chronicler is an attempt to rethink the models that you see in Kings. And why then is Jerusalem destroyed? Has nothing to do with past generations. When you read the account of the destruction of Jerusalem in the chronicler will tell you that at the time of the destruction, the officials of the nation, the priests and the people, corrupted the temple, made it idolatrous and whatnot, or impure, and it was because that generation had sinned, according to the chronicler, that Jerusalem was destroyed. And the chronicler leaves you some hope at the end too, because the chronicler also ends with the account of Cyrus of Persia authorizing the rebuilding of the temple. There's hope in the chronicler. Kings, not quite so certain. But note here, two related, similar, and yet very different accounts. These two histories are in debate with each other intertextually. They have different understandings of why the disaster happened. And so both are part of the Bible. You need to read both and understand that just as we are in the process of trying to understand the Shoah in modern times, so the biblical authors have the same issues at hand. And it doesn't end with Kings and Chronicles. We also have Esther. Esther's a very controversial book. Esther is an historical narrative in that it presents a form of history, but it's often considered to be theologically suspicious. The Hebrew form of Esther does not mention God. The Greek Septuagint version does, very pointedly, because the Septuagint tradition looked at Esther and said, wait a minute, there's a problem here. How do you have a book of the Bible in which God isn't mentioned? Well, we'll put God in. You've got accounts of people praying to God in the book of Esther in Greek that you don't see in Hebrew. And so many interpreters see this problematic. Some say, well, there must be points at which God shows up in Esther. Esther is a queen of Persia. How does she become queen? She becomes queen when the drunken king of Persia has a beauty contest throughout his nation in which he invites young women come apply for the office of queen. All you have to do is spend 6 months getting made up, come and sleep with the king one night, and then he'll decide the next day. Does that sound like a moral paradigm to you? There's some issues with that. But that's how Esther becomes queen. She's not a model of religiosity, number one. Number two, she's Jewish. She's not supposed to intermarry. She marries the biggest Gentile in the world and does so under suspect circumstances. But Esther is also the only person who can save her people at a time when a government decides to murder its entire Jewish population. Oftentimes that lesson is lost in the book of Esther. People claim, well, in the end, the Jews killed Gentiles. It's an anti-Gentile book. Esther is a book about a Shoah. We don't know that it ever actually would have happened, but it raises the issue. And because Esther is queen, however she got there, she is the only person in the world who can do something to stop this genocide from taking place. And she does so at great personal risk. In fact, her uncle Mordecai has to talk her into it. Mordecai in Esther 4 tells Esther, when she's heard about the plans of Haman to kill the Jewish people because allegedly they had betrayed the king. Mordecai tells her that perhaps it was for such a time as this that you were brought to royal power. And many people see that there's a hint that God's behind the scenes. And maybe God is, but God is never explicitly mentioned. God doesn't come in by dividing the Red Sea and swallowing up the Persian executioners. You don't see God destroying the Persian army like God did with the Assyrian Empire when they invaded Judah in Hezekiah's reign. You don't see God acting or mentioned at all. And what it means is one person, not particularly religious, but she's the person who becomes the heroine. And the fact of the matter is, Esther could be any one of us. You know, whether we're religious or not, whether we're male or female. She was the one person, and if she didn't act, then the entire Jewish people would die. God willing, none of you will ever find yourself in that position. Because it's a hard choice to make sometimes, to be the one person who can save the world. But sometimes it comes down to that. And sometimes it comes down to a much smaller scale disaster where you might be the only one who can save the situation. And at that point, you have to stand up and act, even if it's going to cost you Because in Esther's case, she had to appear before the king, and if the king didn't accept her, she would have been put to death. She risked her life to do it. That's what happens sometimes in the world. And you want to note, it's going on right now, once again, folks, between the Kurds, the Yazidis, and everything that's happening right now, in which even Muslims, including Al-Qaeda, have argued that what's taking place in the Middle East right now is not Islamic, does not fit with the moral understanding of Islam. But somebody has to stand up and do something about it. We've seen these situations before. How many nations stood up and said no to Nazi Germany during World War II? None of them. Which was one of the reasons that Hitler concluded that he could get away with it, because nobody was going to protest. Nobody took the role of Esther. And so when you read Esther, even though it's considered theologically suspicious, the absence of God in Esther is actually deliberate. Because when you read Esther as sacred scripture, it belongs in sacred scripture even without God in it. Because it's asking each and every one of you, readers, what would you do if you were in Esther's position and were the only one who could act? Could you stand up and do it? And the answer the book wants from you is, yes, I could. But that's a question that we all have to ask ourselves at various points in our lives. What are we willing to do to stand up in the face of evil and keep the kind of evil that shows up in a Shoah or a genocide or any form of discrimination or death being dealt out to people who are innocent? That's one of the questions that's debated in the Bible. You've got three different answers. Why does evil happen? Joshua through Kings, the sins of past generations. Chronicles, the sins of a present generation. And Esther, there's no sin, but evil happens anyway. And what do we, human beings, do to challenge it and bring it to an end, even at the risk of our lives? So let me conclude with that. And the general word that the Bible is very much concerned with the Shoah. It's an issue that's been around since antiquity. We still see it today, and we see it in our contemporary world, and unless people act, we will see it in the future as well. Thank you.
Do some people want to ask a question? We have a few minutes here. I guess we'll give a couple of minutes for people who want to. We have another 10 minutes, I believe. And Professor Sweeney is here to answer the questions. So, do we have questions? Do we have questions? Yes.
So, thank you very much, Professor Sweeney, for the lecture. Just curious, since the Shoah, there's been a heightened sensitivity to supersessionist readings of the Hebrew Scriptures. Could you talk about that and what sort of sensitivities we should all be conscious of, at least, in our approaches to the Hebrew Scriptures?
Well, one is the notion that Israel is punished because it sinned. That's an attempt to try to explain history. Why did the Shoah happen? Well, it must be because people sinned, because the writers of the Bible do not want to claim that God is in any way at fault. And so they go to pains to try to show it wasn't God. In Joshua, God hands the entire land to Israel. And the only time anything goes wrong is when people sin. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at reconstructing the history of Israel and ask, for example, why did the Assyrian Empire destroy Israel? It wasn't because they had allegedly sinned against their gods. The reason the Assyrians destroyed it was because they had an alliance with Israel at the time that the Bible doesn't mention. And when Israel broke that alliance, the Assyrians invaded. And so what happens is that the writers are trying to make sense of God, and they don't want to blame God, and history. And one of the questions they might ask is, well, wait a minute. God had promised Jacob and Abraham before that, I'll make you a great nation. We'll have a Berit Olam, an eternal covenant. But when the time came in 722 for God to act as protector, that didn't happen. The writers of Kings didn't want to say, God abandoned us unrighteously. They wanted to say that God is still holy. God is still God. And so it must have been our fault. It was a way of taking responsibility oneself. And when reading, for example, the New Testament, you got a similar paradigm. When you read the Gospels, for example, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, you have not only 4 different accounts, which gives you 4 different understandings of Jesus, but every one of those Gospels is based on the premise that Jerusalem was destroyed. And the question, what does this mean for God's action with the world today? In Luke, the capital moves from Jerusalem, and by the end of Acts, it's in Rome. In Mark, the Son of Man is coming for an apocalyptic destruction. Matthew, the life of Jesus is fulfillment of the Old Testament. And John portrays more of an epistemological issue, that Christ becomes the Logos for understanding the world, not Torah. Essentially, the New Testament asks, in the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem, what does the world look like now? And their choice was Christ, and tried to show that Christ was the legitimate outcome, because, in part, of the contention that Jews had sinned. And so when you read in the New Testament, Pharisees are hypocrites and a brood of vipers. Were they? Or is that an attempt to try to explain historical events without trying to blame God for them, but to look at people instead? And so rethinking some of those paradigms of sin and judgment applies to the New Testament as well as to the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old. And again, that question, what do human beings do? Do we oppress Jews for not following Christ? Or do we recognize that there was an eternal covenant and that Jews and Christians can be partners in the world? That actually makes for a very different relationship than what Jews and Christians had, say, in the Middle Ages. Other questions? That quieted everybody down.
All right, this is your chance.
I'm just curious, so you kind of get 3 paradigms with which to deal with evil.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I was just saying, you gave basically 3 paradigms in which
Yes.
the Hebrew Bible
Yes.
deals with
Mhm.
evil. Do you think there are any more in the Hebrew Bible, and if so, what are they?
Yes. Job, I mentioned Job. And Job actually differs from the 3 historical paradigms that I laid out. Because in Job's case, the answer, why does evil take place? We don't know. And what's so striking, and Job keeps asking, if you will tell me what I did, I'll confess my sins, I'll take responsibility, just tell me what I did. And so frequently in life, as we all know, we oftentimes suffer, and we try to explain it, maybe theologically, or maybe other grounds, but oftentimes we're like Job. We don't know why it happened. And what's so striking about Job is at the end, when God reveals oneself to Job, God tells Job, you were right about me. You don't understand why I did this. Because Job doesn't know what we, the reader, know. We read the narrative in which God and Satan are talking, and if you do this to Job, he'll curse you. And of course it doesn't happen. But Job, the character, doesn't know that, and in the end, he never finds out anything other than that what he said was actually right. And it's very, very striking that in a modern book on the Shoah, Elie Wiesel, who's a major Shoah figure, wrote a book called Souls on Fire, which was an account of the Hasidic Jewish community in Eastern Europe prior to the Shoah, in which he pointed out how Hasidic Judaism would raise questions of divine evil. It's part and parcel of Jewish mysticism, of which the Hasidim are a part. And one of the things that Wiesel says in the introduction to his book is that when one stands within one's religious tradition, one can say anything to God. It's when you stand outside of it, that's when it becomes more problematic. But as a believing Jew, or as a believing Christian, you can ask these questions of God because that's part and parcel of demonstrating what faith in God really means. What happens when the world doesn't work the way you want it to, or the way you expect it to? From Wiesel's standpoint, you still maintain your relationship with God, but you can still ask Job's question, why? And it's a righteous thing to do.
One more? I've got all sorts of questions, but I get to have dinner with Professor Sweeney after. All right, well, let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you very much, and I hope this proves to be thought-provoking to you and beneficial to you.